welcome to the Davecast on this Tuesday, May 19th. If you've been watching lately, you know that back on Saturday, we finished up the story of Joseph, which covers the last part of Genesis, chapters 37 through 50. And so during the episodes that we spent on Joseph, we also talked about his ancestry from Abraham, Isaac, and Father Jacob, of course. And I've got to say that I really enjoyed doing that. So I'm thinking, let's just keep on going, all right? Continue right on into the book of Exodus. And so today I'm excited to tell you I'm starting a new series on the book of Exodus. But I want to start by reminding you of the first 5 books of the Bible. They are, of course, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these 5 books are sometimes called the Torah and then also the Pentateuch. And essentially, they're the same thing. That means the same thing. One has its origin in Judaism and one more traditionally in Christianity. Torah comes from the Hebrew word meaning Torah, or literally Torah, which means instruction, direction, law. And Pentateuch is a Greek word that simply just means 5 books. My point is this. Exodus is the second of those 5 books, and it is very much a continuation of the story of Genesis. You know, where one ends, it just picks right up. And so Jacob, also called Israel, at Joseph's invitation, has now moved his clan from Canaan to Egypt because of this horrible famine. And so all 12 sons, the 12 ancestry tribes of the Hebrew people, they come to Egypt. And so if you've ever wondered how the children of Israel became slaves in Egypt, that's why they were there to start with. But it's important to remember that they weren't slaves to begin with. They were immigrants living and working and thriving in Egypt at their brother Joseph's invitation. And so since Joseph was second in command in Egypt, it was a very amicable relationship. And so then we get on to the end of chapter 50, and that's where we read that Joseph dies. And then we turn the page, and we have the book of Exodus. And if you're reading in your Bible, you will see that, chapter 1 starts out by just simply listing those 12 brothers, those 12 tribes. And then it also tells us that all of that generation has now passed away. And then we get down to verse 7, and it tells us that the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, that they multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. They were exceedingly fruitful, which is very much a connection back to Genesis 1:22, where after God had created humankind, he said to them, be fruitful and multiply. And so essentially, the Israelites have finally done what God wanted them to do, but unfortunately, they have done it at a very bad time, because when we move on to the very next verse, it tells us that a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. And so, how will this new king treat Jacob's descendants, these immigrants who have contributed to and made their home in Egyptian society? This king to whom Joseph meant nothing. This king who either didn't remember Joseph's role in keeping the Egyptians alive during this famine, or maybe it was that he knew, but out of his prejudice or his xenophobia had simply chose to ignore that part of history. Because to me, what happens next is more willful than simply just forgetting. The Pharaoh says, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Now, that's not really true. This king's assessment of Israelites, is simply, the Israelites have not, for one thing, grown more populous than the Egyptians. We know that. It's just that they're kind of crossing that threshold, that line of his comfort level. There's too many of them. And then secondly, how does he know this? Why would they join a foreign army and fight against the Egyptians? This is where they lived. It was their home. It's pretty clear that he is just kind of creating fear among the Egyptians to make the Hebrew people the other, the enemy, to make them seem less than human. And so this Pharaoh wastes no time in putting a plan together to deal with them. To start with, it's oppression and slavery, and then eventually it's genocide, murder. I think verse 14 kind of sums up what happened. It says that the Egyptians made their lives bitter with hard service. And if working the Israelite population to the ground wasn't enough, the Pharaoh takes it a step further next. And he asks the Hebrew midwives to kill, this is dark, kill every baby boy that they deliver to Hebrew mothers. But the midwives don't do this. And these two, and we know their names, Shiphrah and Puah, they respond ingeniously by playing right into the Pharaoh's own stereotypes about these immigrants and their breeding habits. He says, why haven't you done what I commanded and killed all those baby boys? And they say to him, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. Sad to say, I've actually heard that sort of folklore told about slave women in America. How they just dropped the babies out while they were picking cotton. And you do understand that that sort of thing is far from the truth. I mean, many of those women died in labor. But my point is this: it's the stereotyping that dehumanizes the other, that makes people seem less than human, kind of like animals or something. And so Shiphrah and Puah, they're very shrewd. They play right into those prejudices, And so, this was their subversive way to save those babies' lives. And so, seeing that clearly the Israelites are not going to kill their own children, he then makes this declaration to the Egyptian population and tells them to throw baby boys, any baby boys, Hebrew baby boys, into the Nile River. And so then we move from chapter 1 into chapter 2, and that's where Moses enters the story as we hear about his birth. And Moses' mother, Jochebed, who's unnamed at this part of the story, but we know her name later, she gives birth to this baby boy, and then for 3 months she keeps it a secret. And though I'm sure it had to have been incredibly stressful with a newborn to keep him quiet, but you can imagine how that might have been possible if he starts to cry. His mother can come in and nurse him and maybe put him under a blanket somewhere, secretive cover. But Moses, after about 3 months and he's getting older, it's becoming just impossible to keep him hidden. And that's when the story takes an interesting turn. We all know about that story, and one I'm sure most of us are familiar with from Sunday school or something. Moses' mother takes a basket, she waterproofs it with this kind of tar-like stuff, and she puts it into the Nile. And then his sister, Miriam, goes and hides in the bushes to see what happens. And that's when the Pharaoh's daughter, comes down to the river to bathe, and she finds the baby floating down the river in the Nile in this basket. And so let me just say that even though the story of Moses' birth and childhood, if you read through it, it's actually really lacking in a whole lot of detail. Within the details of the story that we do know, there is a deeper narrative and some subversive stuff that's kind of going on. It's pretty easy to imagine, reading between the lines here in Exodus 2, that maybe there was some winking and nodding that was going on. Now, traditionally, Pharaoh's daughter, is kind of depicted as sort of this clueless airhead. Look, a baby! I think I'll keep him. But maybe she's shrewder than that, you think? And maybe she stands as evidence that God can work through people who don't claim themselves to be believers. Now think about it. Who would find a child in this place at this time and not know who it belonged to. It was a Hebrew baby. You know, as daughter of Pharaoh, there's no way she couldn't have known about the policy of her father. She knew that Hebrew babies had been ordered to be killed. I mean, this is a public pronouncement. So what other rational explanation could have been there for a baby boy to be floating there in a waterproof basket, hidden among the tall reeds, except that one of these Hebrew families was trying to hide their baby boy from the authorities? It just seems clear to me that Pharaoh's daughter had to have known, and that she had to sort of defied her father's edict and made possible this child's safekeeping. Think about it. You know, she finds this baby floating in a basket, and suddenly, this young girl just happens to step out from the bushes and say, "Oh, wow, I see you got a baby there. Would you like me to go find someone to nurse that baby for you?" What's really going on here? Can you almost imagine that their eyes sort of locked? It's kind of nodding and saying, yes, I would very much like for you to do that. Got anyone in mind in particular? You know, because having a wet nurse, excuse me, from the slave class, that wouldn't have been unusual. Egyptian women would have done that. But I assume that there would have been usual channels for the house of Pharaoh to find their servants. And so I would suggest to you here that we have at least a hint of Pharaoh's daughter, contracting with someone outside those usual channels, as a means of kind of keeping it a secret from her father, keeping the baby sort of hid away until he's a little older. And so Miriam goes and comes back with her own mother, the birth mother of the child. And Pharaoh's daughter has, she pays her to watch her own baby. And so after a time, Moses is placed back into the Pharaoh's daughter's hands. And so one of the lessons that I wanted to point out from today is the irony that Pharaoh had seen only the boys as a threat. But don't you see, it's really the girls. It's these women, Shiphrah and Puah, Moses' mom and sister Miriam, and even the daughter of Pharaoh, who set in motion what's going to be the downfall of Pharaoh. After the child is old enough to be weaned, he's returned to Pharaoh's daughter, who takes him in and raises him as her own son. And of course, Moses goes on to be an instrument of God's will through him. God does amazing things with Moses and will bring the deliverance of the Hebrew people out of slavery into the promised land. But Moses' story simply wouldn't have happened if not for these women who refused to abide to the Pharaoh's law, because that law, was at its heart unjust. I really love these stories. I just think they're in and of themselves just amazing. It shows that so many times it is the people that we might not think about, inconsequential people sometimes, doing the right thing that makes all the difference. And what you and I do with that, I guess, is up to us, right? When we choose to do what's just, what is right, when we choose life over death, it makes a difference. Never forget that. And so that's how the story begins, and there's a whole lot more to Exodus to come. But we will continue that on Thursday, and so for now, keep bringing the hope, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.